So it seems that Games Workshop's dropped some rather wild updates for the Imperial and Chaos Knights. We've got updated stats for the Imperials, changed profiles for the Cerastus Knights and the Forge World ones, official points for the Chaos Knights, and enormous points drops for the Imperial Knights that feel like they're maybe going to make one of the strongest factions in the game yet stronger. Let's talk through all the changes in turn and what they might mean for the big stompy robots of Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Imperial and Chaos Knights. This week it was pretty expected that Games Workshop would be releasing official Codex points for the Chaos Knights. I did think it was kind of likely they might update the Forge World index for them at the same time, though I wasn't expecting them to do things with the Imperials, and we've got a bigger update than expected. Going live on Games Workshop's download page around about 12 hours ago were a whole raft of updated documents. Going through them in turn, we've got the Minotaur and Field Manual, which has both got updated points for the Chaos Knights for their Codex, and also updated Imperial Knight points, as Games Workshop's perhaps rather surprisingly updated the digital index for them in a big way, giving them the same sort of profiles as the Chaos Knights, lower toughness values but massive points cuts to go with them, overall probably adding up to a small downgrade for the Armigers but enormous buffs for all the Titanic Knights. As well as that, there's the two Imperial armor documents, both for the Imperial and Chaos. I did think it seemed kind of likely that the Cerastus Knights would get the toughness 11 change and get some more wounds to compensate, and that's what's happened. They also seem to have got really quite big points cuts, as was rumoured by the points cuts circulated to content creators. Otherwise, they seem to have made a few more changes. There's the balanced data slate that removed the Chaos Knight changes that were in that before. I think they've updated their index FAQ document to take the Chaos Knight FAQs out of it as best I can tell. There were a couple of other non-Knight related things, fixing the points on Sisters Repentia and a combat patrol for the Harlequins Twilight Cavalcade, but certainly a pretty knightly focused update. As mentioned, feels like the changes to the Imperial Knights do seem kind of mad and really powerful, and this comes in context of them being an army which had the win rates about as high as they get for 40k, around about 56% or so, and have been taking down a few grand tournaments as well, despite often being a bit more oppressive in casual metas as opposed to at the very top tier of the game. There still wasn't stopping them from winning a good few grand tournaments though. Potentially it could be a bit of a stopgap, and the Imperial Knight Codex will make these new lower points make more sense, but until then it looks like a pretty enormous power boost to an army that really didn't seem like they needed one. Before we jump into the changes, while we're focused on Knights, I might just give a quick shout out to the channel giveaway. The July giveaway for the channel will be for a custom Knight household, basically 4 people getting their choice of any 3 plastic Titanic Knights. They can be Imperial or Chaos, or swapping any one of them out for 4 Armigers or War Dogs. I'll cycle back to this one at the end of the video for any folks interested, and talk through the rules for entering a little bit more in depth. First up, I think it's fairly interesting enough news to see them do a major update to the Imperial Knights digital index in the first place. It's just kind of surprising that it's necessary, and it seems like Codex Imperial Knights has been delayed and pushed back multiple times at this point for reasons we don't know. Games Workshop originally had it early in 2025, coming up around about a similar time to Garden Eldari, but just didn't turn up, and when they did a new roadmap, Imperial Knights was pushed back later. Then I was strongly expecting it to come out alongside Chaos Knights, as they had done in 9th edition, but then we got a solo Chaos Knight Codex release with no Imperials to be seen, despite it making sense to update the factions in tandem to prevent different Knights having very different stat lines in the game. If they'd done that, then there'd be no need for any sort of temporary stopgap index, and in their article announcing the changes they said that Codex Imperial Knights is still a little way off, and we'll keep you posted on a release date as soon as we have it. No explanation there as to if or why they're having trouble with it. It kind of makes me wonder if they're having some sort of issues with printing the codex itself. Maybe for some reason there's been a mistake so big that they couldn't ship the book in its current version and they had to print a whole bunch more copies of it or something. Or maybe there were some sort of problems with the repackaging of the Questoris Knights to get the Canis Rex ones and the Defenders out. But if everything was going smoothly behind the scenes, it feels like they probably would have released it early in the year as per their roadmap, or with Chaos Knights, as seemed likely. The digital index maybe implies that it's not going to be super soon, as if it was, then what would be the point in even doing one in the first place? So if they do announce it at the end of the week for pre-order or something like that, it'll make the choice to put a stopgap digital index in place even weirder. In any case though, in the big changes for the Imperial Knights update, they have altered some things in line with Codex Chaos Knights, but not literally everything on the core stat lines. It does look like the majority of the changes are still being held back for the Codex, presumably changes to the unit rules and abilities. I guess they've chosen to do this sort of halfway house type thing to keep the Knight profiles the same, so that you don't have sets of Armigers in the game that have toughness 10 while the War Dogs have toughness 9, and the same for the Questoris and the Abominants being tier 11. This hasn't really usually been a problem for them in the past though. For example, in 9th edition we had Chaos Space Marines running around with 1 wound when their Imperial brothers had 2 the entire time. They didn't feel the need to issue errata or digital updates there. As with the Chaos Knights, the stat lines have changed. Armigers are now toughness 9 but gain 2 wounds to 14 wounds. The Questoris are toughness 11 but gain 4 wounds to 26. And the Dominus Knights are 28 wounds but dropping down to toughness 12 and just a 3+ save, not a 2+. The durability changes are impactful, but I wouldn't say they're enormously impactful power-wise. The far bigger change has been massively slashed points cuts, with most of the Titanic Knights dropping around about 60 points or so, some far more. And they'll also be able to use the updated profiles for the Forge World Knights, which have seen just a few other tweaks. Otherwise though, most of the datasheets are the same. Most of the knightly weapon profiles are similar, bar the Armiger ones. For example, the Chaos Knight Tyrant had some updated profiles on its primary weapons, but the Imperials haven't got that yet, and they don't seem to have been messing around with Bondsman or datasheet abilities. For the Knight durability, if points had stayed the same, which they haven't, I would argue that it was a side grade, not a downgrade, in spite of what much of the internet seems to think. Getting +4 wounds on the Questoris takes the edge off the profiles that are better against it. Against las cannons, they are less tough, though only around about 90% of what they were previously. Not a huge difference in my opinion. Against Strength 6 they are notably worse, so certain armies that spam it like Blood Angels or World Eaters will hit them harder. But against everything else their health bar went up in a fairly meaningful way, basically plus 18% durability. And that includes things like mortal wounds and grenades, all the big scary strength 14 plus anti-tank weapons mounted on various vehicles, melter weapons, plasma weapons, units that rely on lethal hits to deal damage, or anything with the anti-vehicle keyword. All of those things will find Questoris Knights meaningfully harder to take down, though all of this pales into comparison with the points cuts that they got. Because they went down in points, they're basically both tougher and fightier per the point that you pay per wound of knight on the table. Armigers have it fairly similarly. They're going to be easier to kill with strength 9, 10 and strength 5, but they basically got plus 70% tougher against just about everything else, including much of the above, and dedicated anti-tank weapons, including las cannons. Overall, feel like the durability changes are broadly a positive in my opinion. It means that more armies can meaningfully interact with knights, but they have compensated by giving them essentially a bigger health bar, so more things can meaningfully hurt them, but they will absorb more damage. Of course though, on top of that, they've given them some massive points cuts, so they're just directly massively better by every metric. And the single craziest points change has to be Canis Rex dropping down to 380 points, a big 70 points less. Maybe the plan is that his abilities get significantly less impactful when the Imperial Knight Codex comes out, but until that happens, that just seems like an absolutely crazy decision. Imperial Knights are already one of the stronger armies in the game. Canis Rex at 450 points seem to be basically auto-include in the vast majority of competitive lists, so to give him a pretty enormous 70-point meaningful points cut feels like a pretty mad decision, never mind the fact that you can field him in every Imperial army as well as an ally if he'd want. I feel like at 380 points for his raw damage, both at range and in melee, plus his free stratagems, almost no army is going to find him a particularly bad choice. For the other Questoris, they're all cheaper, but not quite so much cheaper as they were. The most expensive ones now are the Crusader and Warden, both at 365, and both taking around about big 80-point cuts there. Then there's the Errant Gallant and Paladin, all down to 345, the Paladin having the biggest relative cut, losing a big 60 points on what it was before. And then the cheapest knight is the Preceptor, down at 335 points, though I feel like that's still going to be overshadowed by the rest. I feel like the rest are going to be worth the upgrade. I wasn't really expecting Games Workshop to put these down to a similar sort of price tag to the Chaos, at least not with the 6+ Feel No Pain and the inbuilt rerolls that they get in the index. They're just going to be far more efficient in damage and defense purposes, so very surprising to see that the Imperials are only paying a 10-point tax for much better direct support, even if the Chaos can lean into -1 to hit at long range if it makes sense these days. As mentioned, I kind of wonder if these points are just going to reflect the new abilities in the Imperial Knight Codex when it comes out, and they aren't really meant for the index at all. So if that's the case, then it's maybe an odd decision to release them early if they're reflective of knights that are buffed by abilities far better than they're intended to be. I think these are easily enough to make Titanic Knights in general to be absolutely back as a really strong option. This will be a genuine choice to rival the Armigers again. Pretty well all the datasheets seem usable to me. I feel like at first impressions, maybe out of the non-Canis Rex ones, the Crusader and the Paladin might be some of the most interesting. Literally all of the others seem like they've got some good draws though, maybe besides the Preceptor. For the Armigers, their points stayed the same, so just had the durability side grade, and they did have a couple more clear nerfs beyond that. Like the Chaos ones, their OC dropped down to 6, and then it drops down to 3 if they're damaged. So if they've got 5 wounds or less, then they're -1 to hit, as well as having the less OC, and that will make them meaningfully less impactful on objectives and holding primaries. Another big nerf to the Armiger Warglaive specifically was the Thermal Spear dropping in range. It's now only 18 inches, the same as the Chaos Wardog version. This one seemed very likely to happen, and that is a somewhat big nerf to a pretty powerful gun. Sometimes they're not going to be able to get in range of the targets they really want to strike, and occasionally they won't be in melter range if they are. The Imperial ones do seem to keep battle line, unlike the Chaos ones, and I think that seems likely given that the Imperials only have 2 variants where the Chaos have lots more. Overall, it does seem like it's a nerf for Armigers, though not an enormous one. In the context of the big knight points cuts though, it probably is going to be enough to push them into a more supporting role as opposed to dominating the damage and defense as they seem to have been doing more recently. Then for the core index update, we've got the Dominus Knights points. In a document, they listed them as going down 115 points. I think they only went down 85 because they had reduced them down to 480 previously. Either way though, they got an enormous points cut of almost 20%, and I feel like that's more than enough to offset their defensive nerf, dropping to T12 with a 3+ save rather than Toughness 13 with a 2+. They did gain 4 wounds. I feel like that was more obviously a downgrade on the defensive profile than the others due to the save change. Castellans in particular were already solid enough at 480 points given the big rerolls that they can get, and some nice enough shooting buffs in their detachment. It could be really quite nice with Mysterious Guardian to be warping around the table and drawing line of sight on something important. And Castellan Knights at 395 points just seem absolutely monstrous in terms of the stats to deal with the opponent. Volcano Lancers can very easily be picking up tanks in single shots with a pretty good reliability with the rerolls inbuilt. They've got plenty more threatening guns besides that. Feels like they might have gained a bit more ground on some of the Questoris with a slightly outsized points cut. I'm perhaps pretty mad that you can field 3 Castellans in a list and still have 800 points left over. I'm certainly more used to them being 500 points or so on the table. The Valiant's also 395 as well, and it still seems like that'd compare badly versus the Castellan at current cost, though obviously it also got far stronger. Next up, let's take a look at the Imperial armor indexes, and we'll have a look at both the Imperial and Chaos ones. First up, we've got the Cerastus pattern knights. It did seem likely that they'd drop down in toughness with the rest of the knight patterns. They're now toughness 11 and 28 wounds, so -1 toughness but +3 wounds. It's not quite as good of a trade-off as the Questoris patterns who got +4, but I'd say not enormously different. Durability was already a strong point for the Cerastus Knights, particularly the Lancer with its 4+ invulnerable save and the Atropos with its invulnerable in melee. For the Imperials, all their versions dropped down to 365 points, so around about a 60-point drop for the majority of them. The Atropos and Lancer were already very good, and they stay very good relative to the others. I'm still sure that they'll be very popular. The Acheron's still not going to compete well at that points cost, though the Castigator gets a pretty outsized buff and drops down more like 100 points. I'm not entirely sure why that one was quite so much more, but feels like he's gained adequately to the point of genuinely being a good option again. The Chaos versions are similar and at 355 points, so also an outsized drop for the Castigator. Maybe the Lancer seemed like it was the one that saw the most play in top lists previously, so might still be the one to watch the most. I still say that probably the Imperial Lancer and Atropos seem like they're going to be some of the most powerful ones here. It's just a pretty crazily efficient points cost for their stat lines. Otherwise, it seems like the Acastus Knights, the Porphyrion and the Asterius didn't change. One of the versions was very slightly different between Imperial and Chaos, but now they're both 700 for the Porphyrion, and their Asterius versions remain 765. These feel like they're models that are sort of over the certain points level and enormous near Titan size things that Games Workshop just doesn't really try to balance them. It feels like things around about this sort of weight class, similar to the Orc Stomper, just seem to get neglected in balance updates, so certainly in context of all the other knights getting far cheaper, these guys were pretty bad before and have fallen yet further behind. Their stat lines are unchanged though, they retain their big toughness 13 and a 2+ save. I'd certainly be far more tempted to take multiple cheap Castellans over this guy though, never mind all the other variants that they're competing against. The biggest changes in the indexes came to the Questor Magaera and the Questor Styrix. Both of those for the Imperial and the Chaos got the Questoris and Abhorrent durability changes, so dropping down to toughness 11 at 26 wounds. They also got the big points cuts though, so the Chaos versions are 345 and the Imperial's very slightly more expensive at 355. The Styrix has had its big Volkite weapon buffed in a similar sort of way to the Knight Abominant of the Chaos Knights. It gained +3 shots, and I feel like that's quite a big deal in making it far more on par with most of the other knightly ranged weapons out there. It now has a far more respectable damage output, though it's still going to be very swingy depending on whether or not you roll those 6s to wound for the devastating wounds. Otherwise, the abilities both for the Chaos and the Imperials were swapped around. The Styrix for the Chaos gives you an aura of ignores cover for shooting war dogs nearby. That does genuinely seem like a pretty excellent buff, maybe for executioners in particular, though I'm sure brigands would like it as well. For the Imperials, it's maybe slightly less good news. You give the bondsman ability out to one of the Armigers, and then when that Armiger targets enemy units, they take battle shock tests, so kind of on the situational side as to whether that matters. For the Magaera, that's the one with the lightning cannon. That gives you an aura of assault for war dogs for Chaos, so you could have some fast moving ones while shooting, the same buff as the Chaos Lancer gets. And then for the Imperials, it's got quite an interesting bondsman ability, giving you +1 strength and +1 AP for ranged attacks against the closest targets. I feel like that's pretty significant and stand out for the Helverin. Change your autocannons from strength 9 AP 1 and damage 3 to strength 10 AP 2 and damage 3, which really is a massive difference. It does only affect the one model though, unless you take the enhancement. At first impressions of these, I'm not sure they're necessarily hugely more standout than before. I feel like both of them seem usable enough, but maybe just a little bit behind the regular Questoris and Abhorrent patterns for the most part in direct competition. I feel like the Imperial buff for the Magaera is quite interesting, though it does have the downside of a really not that general purpose lightning cannon. The Chaos Ignores cover buff is pretty interesting for the Styrix though. Finally, for the Imperial Armor Knights, there's the Wardog Moirax. This one gets the same changes with toughness 9 and 14 wounds, plus the OC6 thing like the other Armigers and Wardogs. It seems like it's no longer battle line for the Chaos Knights, though remains so for the Imperials. Still has an interesting selection of ranged weapons, though it's still paying a points premium, if slightly less of one than before. It drops down to 150 points, so that's still going to make it the most expensive Wardog or Armiger. I'd still be kind of surprised to see them take off as the new best thing somehow, but feels like they're far more usable as a support one. Maybe it could be an option if you've got 10 points left over and you've got a regular Armiger, you could consider the upgrade. I guess the Thermal Spear's been nerfed for a bunch of other Armigers and Wardogs, probably helps them by comparison too. Finally, we've got the Chaos Knight points costs, and it does appear that all of these are as expected, in line with the content creator ones that Games Workshop sent out, and then their official content creators repost and people share around the internet. As anticipated, all the Titanic Knights are looking rather good at very cheap costs. The Abominant is the cheapest at 325 points, and people seem to be genuinely seeing that as a very strong option now. It got the boosted Volkite and still has some fun special rules. Otherwise, the Desecrator, Rampager and Despoiler are all 335. They all also seem some pretty solid variants. The Rampager being a fast run-in and destroy everything melee attack. It did lose advance and charge in the Codex though, so got toned down in one way there. The Desecrator is a nice generalist with a good Wardog buff, and the Knight Despoiler seems fairly stand out with the sheer damage output that you can put out. Maybe in particular wielding dual Gatling cannons in the Infernal Lance if anything. The Knight Ruinator was kind of surprisingly a bit of a dud at 350 points compared with the rest. Its abilities feel like it should be one of the very cheapest of the Abhorrent Knights, maybe the single cheapest one. For some reason it's the most expensive compared with the others though at 350. And then the Knight Tyrant seems to be 395, the same as the Loyalist Castellan, though given that the Loyalists get their 6+ Feel No Pain and their big rerolls for that deadly Volcano Lance, the Loyalist one is just so much more efficient. For the Wardogs, they had their durability changes. They're all 140 points besides the Executioner, which is 130. There are various interesting changes. I feel like people's reactions to the changes were that the Stalker and the Carnivore seemed like the most interesting ones. The Carnivore was awesome before and didn't really lose too much, still having absolutely monstrous damage, and the Stalker has the Scout keyword now, which has some extra draw, getting Knights into the midfield nice and fast. The others all seem absolutely usable enough, and might see a bit more play given that they don't get battle line outside of the Handpack Lance anymore. I'd guess in face of the Titanic changes though, there won't be quite so many people trying to spam out maximal numbers of them. Then finally for the Chaos Knights, we've got their enhancement list. Most of these are as printed in the Codex. It seems that they've increased the ones for the Lords of Tread basically across the board. To be fair, most of those were really quite powerful enhancements between the passive buff that they can give plus their once per game thing, and most of those still seem fine. Having Warpborn Stalker for just 10 points still, it seems 100% auto-include for Shooty Knight though, just warping around the board and melting something with a guaranteed line of sight. Otherwise most seem to be the same. The Veil of Medringard dropped down 5 points for the Traitorous Lance interestingly. Not sure why that got cheaper given that the invulnerable saves that one brought seemed like it was a pretty easy pickup in the first place. For first impressions, the Chaos Knight points and changes had already been at least fairly well known. Looks like they're probably going to be one of the stronger factions in 40k at first impressions. They will be interesting to see when they hit tournaments. It does feel like from this update though, they've been rather eclipsed by the Imperials just for sheer power, at least in the short term until their Codex comes out. You can get all sorts of fairly mad builds with the Imperial Knights now. I can't see any reason that you wouldn't run Canis Rex at 380 points, who just seems very badly balanced, both externally and internally. But to back him up, you can have all sorts of different combos. You could run him with 12 Armigers now. You could back him up with 2 Lancers, 2 Crusaders, and a Acastus Assassin. A pretty ridiculous combo of sheer firepower and massive melee might there. You could go for a melee rush of Canis Rex with 3 Lancers, 3 Armigers for some support, and a Acastus Assassin. Or maybe go absolutely maximal firepower, 2 Crusaders, 2 Castellans, and a Acastus. If there's anything that's sticking its nose out of cover there, it's going to get absolutely obliterated in short order. Definitely feels like there's going to be far more big knights in army lists as a result though. I guess maybe we see some slightly more balanced lists, starting with Mr. Canis Rex, adding at least a few more big variants and some Armigers for actions and utility and screening and things. The points drops both for the Imperials and Chaos feel like knight armies may well need more knights than they had. Compared with some changes in 40k, I feel like this one maybe feels like a slightly more obvious thought out sales decision from Games Workshop. This is about as cheap as knights have ever been to field in game. If you're fielding 3 Titanic Knights now, there's a pretty reasonable chance that you could field some combos of 4 of them now for the same points cost. Maybe not exactly, though not really too far off. For impacts on 40k balance, the Imperial Knights in particular just really don't seem like they're going to be a good thing in the short term. The big changes to the points drops for Titanic Knights I think already seemed like they were going to be pretty strong. This one just basically seems like the same but far more efficient for the Imperials. Pretty much the same datasheets and the same points cost, with much more powerful supporting rules with big feel no pains and big inbuilt rerolls. Just mathematically it feels like a bit of a dumb decision when the faction's already on around about a 56% win rate or so. They can win some grand tournaments, even if they don't have quite as much subtlety as some other factions. They're certainly the sort of army that can absolutely stomp armies at a more casual or RTT style level, and that looks like it's only going to get worse. Canis Rex getting better somehow is just kind of mad given that he was so strong already, and that might have consequences for other Imperial armies maybe wanting to field him. The Armigers to me do feel overall nerfed, but not really hugely. I feel like we won't see quite so many people running, say, 10 plus of them, though I guess we'll see. I think some of them are going to get outcompeted by the Questoris, Cerastus, or Castellans that got cheaper. In particular, the Atropos, Crusader, and Lancer all seem very nice. Feels like at least in the short term there should be a bigger points difference between the Imperial and Chaos Knights, though as mentioned earlier, if they do wind up having a codex that just drastically decreases the inbuilt buffs that they get, the points cost might wind up making more sense. Obviously we don't know if that's actually going to be the case at this point yet. It still maybe feels a bit on the lazy side that if that is the case, to give them slightly busted points costs in the interim. In any case, I guess we'll see a lot more people playing Imperial Knights and probably stomping tournaments with them. Looks like they're going to be even more of a terrifying stat check army to face than currently. Let me know your thoughts on the big knight changes down in the comments. What do you make of them and how impactful do you think it'll be on 40k in general? I look forward to having a read over your comments. As mentioned earlier though, I'll just cycle back to the Big Knight Household giveaway. That's the channel one for June. As mentioned, the prizes for this one will be for 4 people to basically pick any 3 plastic Titanic Knights, any 3 Imperials or Chaos in any combination, and any one can be swapped out for 4 Armigers or War Dogs. For combos that could work with that, you could have a Chaos combo like this one with the Ruinator, Knight Tyrant and a Knight Lancer. Here's an Imperial example with the new Knight Defender, a Knight Valiant, and then 2 sets of Armigers to lead the way. Or if you wanted, you could go heavy War Dog or Armiger spam, say a Knight Abhorrent and 8 War Dogs here. Whichever one you'd be tempted by, as ever there's 2 equal ways to enter the channel giveaways, and they're linked down in the video description. Either you can support the channel via Patreon for any paid amount, that gets you automatic entry into the giveaways each month, as well as being the main thing that supports the channel and the content I make. Otherwise, you can enter the giveaways completely for free, and in doing so support the channel via social media and the algorithms. To do that, you do these 3 actions: subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the Facebook page linked down in the video description, and then to enter the draw on Facebook, a post appears on the 1st of July. It appears at midnight UK time and is active for 24 hours. If within that time you respond to it with a picture of any 40k mini or imagery, and your name and the date within the same photo, then you're entered into the draw. The photo thing is to stop Facebook bots and spammers and make sure prizes go to real people. In any case, after the 24 hours is up, I lock the post and do the draw. Everyone's entered just once, and the draw is done with a random number generator, picking out the 4 winners in this case, and it'll be announced on the channel update video on the 4th of July. I'll then get in touch with the people who've won it, ask which knights they'd like, and post them out after I've received my orders of them. If you want the new defender for the Imperials, it might be a bit of a wait depending on exactly when Games Workshop release them. In any case though, the Facebook and Patreon will both be linked down in the video description. Feel free to check them out if you'd like to enter for this one. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular Warhammer 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. As well as entry to the giveaways, the Patreon page has a few other advantages, occasionally seeing certain videos early, votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and a few other benefits such as names in their credits. It's linked down in the video description if interested. Massive thanks to anyone choosing to support, but in any case an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.